So hello everyone, thanks very much for joining us this evening. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce you all to Leif Bersweden, wonderful orchid expert, general botanist, all things plant fanatic, and author of the book The Orchid Hunter, to talk to us today about, well, obviously, what else could it be? Orchids in our sand dunes. Leif, in that case, take it away, and I will just have to try and click for you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I hope this goes okay. I do apologize. Well, hello everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for giving up a little bit of your evening to to indulge me talking about orchids. It's one of my favorite things to do, and I love it when I've actually got an audience because I think my housemate is getting a bit bored of me going on and on about plants all the time. So it's nice to have a few people around to actually listen who want to listen to a bit of a chat about plants. Thanks also to Emma. Very kind words in your introduction. I feel like I've got a lot to live up to now, but hopefully I'll be able to do that in the next half an hour, 40 minutes or so. So yes, my name's Leif. I am a botanist, in case you hadn't gathered that already. And I have loved wild plants basically as long as I can remember. And this evening I'm going to be talking to you about orchids, and specifically the orchids that we get in our sand dunes here in England and Wales. My interest in orchids started when I was much younger and sort of dominated my teenage years. I spent so much time swanning around the fields and the woods looking for orchids throughout my childhood. And this all culminated in a big summer-long orchid hunt in the summer of 2020, which was enormous fun. But I spent the whole summer trying to find as many wild orchids in Britain and Ireland as I could in that summer. And so I spent a great deal of time in sand dunes during that summer, looking for things like the early marsh orchid, the fen orchid, and bee orchids, which you can see here. Yes, so I'm going to ask Emma to skip on to the next slide. And if you could click 3 times, I think, yeah, perfect. So there are more than 50 different species of orchid in Britain and Ireland, which is actually incredible when you think about it. I think orchids are surrounded by this aura of rarity and mystery, and they're always associated with the tropics and with the rainforest. But actually, even Britain, rainy, cold, grey Britain, has more than 50 different wild orchid species growing here. Now they grow up and down the country. They grow on the Lizard Peninsula down in Cornwall at the most southerly point, all the way up to the top of Shetland. So they cover the entire length and breadth of the country. They grow in pretty much every single habitat you can think of. Various species have been found on green roofs in London. You may be aware of some tongue orchids recently, which have been found on the top of a bank in London. So they kind of grow everywhere. I think when I was thinking about this earlier, I think salt marshes are the only place I could think of where I've never seen orchids growing before. But pretty much every other habitat, you'll get orchids. And sand dunes are an incredibly important habitat for orchids in this country, and they're probably it's probably one of the harshest environments that they're found growing in, certainly within England and Wales. So next slide, please. There you go. So in the planning of this talk, I spent quite a lot of time trying to find the perfect image of sand dunes to illustrate what I was trying to talk about. Because this evening I'm going to be taking you on a journey from the sea all the way through the sand dune, through the different habitats, to the grassland at the back of the dunes. And I looked and looked and looked and couldn't find the perfect picture. So I It looks like a 5-year-old has drawn this, this picture, but believe it or not, it was actually me who drew this, and I am secretly quite proud of it. But this is a sand dune showing all the various different habitats that I'm going to talk to you about. So if Emma could click once, we've got the sand dunes themselves, which are actually probably the most boring part of it, which I realize is ironic because I'm giving a talk about orchids and sand dunes. And then the next habitat for the next click will be the dune slacks. There we go. Oh, that'll do. Yeah. Okay. The dune slacks are these sort of damp depressions in the dune system, where you get you might get winter flooding, or they might be underwater most of the time. So you get very, very different vegetation forming in those depressions. Then the next one is the sandy grassland, which builds up at the back of the dune. So these are sort of the more established dunes where you've got more vegetation growing and more vegetation sort of holding all the sand and the soil together. And then finally, we've got pine plantations, which I'll talk about very briefly because they don't appear behind most of the dunes, but there are a few orchids in there as well. So they're the overall habitats that we're going to explore. So if Emma could move on to the next slide, and we'll talk about the dunes. So as I said, these are very harsh environments. They are they're dry, they are very salty, they are constantly exposed to the more extreme weather. So you've got storms coming in off the coast, you've got sunshine coming down on them all day on the sunny days, and so they're very, very hostile environments to grow in. And as I say, on top of the dunes themselves, you won't really get too many orchids. It's largely restricted to marram grass up there. I don't know the technical term for these things, but in my head, they're just big piles of sand with a few, bits of marram grass sticking out the top. So not much can grow there other than the marram grass. But I have managed to find a couple of species up sort of towards the top of the dunes. So the first one, if Emma could click, is the frog orchid. Very nice, thank you. So the frog orchid is a very small plant. It's sort of 5 to 15 centimeters tall. It's just coming into flower now, and I found it sort of on the side of the dune, so it's above the dune slack, but sort of not quite up at the top of the dune. And these things are very, very difficult to spot, but quite a nice little species to find. The other one, if Emma could click again, thank you, is the dune Hellebrin. And this, it's got dune in the name. You can kind of tell where this one lives. The dune Hellebrin is a rather unusual species that's one of the more recent additions to the British orchid flora. But there are good populations of this one at Sandscale Hawes in Cumbria, on the Ainsdale dune system just south of Southport on the northwest coast of England, and various other places in the UK. But I will talk a bit more about this one on the next slide. Very nice. I think there are, if you click once first, Emma. So the dune Hellebrin has this really long, complicated history. Back at the beginning of the 20th century, it was considered to be a narrow-lipped Hellebrin, which is a species which is generally found in chalk beech woods down in the south of England. I'm not really sure why anyone thought this was a narrow-lipped Hellebrin, because it looks very different and grows in a completely different habitat a long way away. And so I don't really know why anyone thought this was a narrow-lipped Hellebrin, but they did. And in 1921, I think it was, that was when they first sort of thought, okay, maybe this is actually something different. And so we're going to call it a subspecies of narrow-lipped Hellebrin. Then 5 years later, it became its own species. It was declared to be another species in the orchid flora of the UK. And then for the next, the best part of a century, 50, 75 years or so, it was just flip-flopped between subspecies to species to subspecies species. And no one really knew what to do with it. None of the taxonomists could work out what it was and where it fitted into our system of things. But after lots and lots of toing and froing, scientists at Edinburgh carried out some DNA work on all the Hellebrins in the country, and they found that the Dune Hellebrin was sufficiently different from the narrow-lipped Hellebrins to be considered this different species. And so finally, in 2002, after all this flip-flopping around, it was settled upon that Dune Hellebrin was actually its own species. Now, to make it slightly more complicated, there are two different forms. There's the form which grows in the sand dunes. It does what it says on the tin. It sort of really behaves and grows in the dunes. And then there are also populations in the Tyne Valley in Northumberland, and they grow on zinc deposits in the ground, and they look slightly different. They're known as the Tyne Hellebrins. They're actually the same species, they're just subspecies. But what this work by these scientists at Edinburgh did was incredible, actually. They found a brand new orchid species that no one even knew existed. No one even suspected existed, I don't think. And they found it on the holy island of Lindisfarne on the Northumberland coast. So if Emma could click twice, I think. Yes, nice, thanks. So this one was named the Lindisfarne Hellebrin. So this one grows in the sand dunes on Holy Island, just off the coast of Northumberland. It's a small population that grows in the sand dunes there. And to be honest, if you showed me a photo of a Lindisfarne Hellebrin and a photo of a Dune Hellebrin and didn't give me any information about where the photo had been taken or the habitats or anything like that, I'm not sure I could tell you the difference between the two. They do look almost identical. As far as I'm aware, the Lindisfarne Hellebrin has a yellowish base to its flower stalk, whereas the Dune Hellebrin has a slightly purplish one. But other than little differences like that, they do look very, very similar. And so it's hardly surprising that they were considered the same thing for so long. But the DNA has shown us that they're actually nice and distinct. But what's really cool about that one is there are 300 plants just growing on Holy Island. As far as we're aware, it doesn't grow anywhere else, not only in the whole country, but in the whole world. So it's endemic to Britain, endemic to Holy Island, and there are more giant pandas in the world than there are Lindisfarne Hellebrins, which I think is great. Well, it's not great. It'd be great if there were more of them, but it's a cool fact. So yes, that's the Dune Hellebrin. So next slide. And here we move on to the Dune slacks. So the Dune slacks are arguably the most unique, the most special of all these habitats within the sand dune system. They form, as I said earlier, these depressions between the different sand dunes with a very, very different composition of vegetation, because these depressions get flooded during the winter, or there's always sort of they're always very damp, and so they get covered by willows, creeping willows, which is this low-growing plant, and various other nice things like marsh orchids and brookweed and spearworts and things. Now, the reason they're particularly good habitats is because the dunes are obviously next to the sea, and they're full of seashells. And the seashells have a really high calcium content. And for many orchids, many plants generally, calcium is like the best thing ever. It's just like, they just need it. They need it so badly. And it's this incredible nutrient. And of course, with this period of time where you've got sort of temporary floods in these depressions, that helps break down the shells and put the calcium into the environment, and then the plants can take them up. So it's a particularly rich part for orchids. So the first one, the first click, will be the early marsh orchid. And there's a very specific subspecies of early marsh orchids, which is called coccinea, which is this red thing here, which is, it doesn't grow in any other habitat. So it's specifically adapted to growing in the dune slacks. It's relatively common in the dunes. Any big sand dune system with lots of dune slacks will almost certainly have them around the UK. I've highlighted Holm Dunes in Norfolk and the dunes around Southport, which are meant to have big populations of it. This photo was taken at Kenfig down in South Wales. So they're sort of all the way around. The next species is the Fen Orchid, which is arguably the most famous of all the dune slack orchids. It is incredibly rare. It grows in 2 areas in the UK, but only one of which is actually in the sand dunes, and that's down at Kenfig, sort of along the coast between Swansea and Cardiff. There's this great big expanse of sand dunes. Now, I'll talk about this a bit more. So yes, the next slide has a few photos of the Fen Orchid, which is this tiny, tiny plant. You have to be like a massive orchid nut to go and see this one, because it's about 5 centimeters tall, really, really small. And as you can see, it's very green. It doesn't have, big, blousy, fancy flowers. It's kind of halfway between the color of the sand and the vegetation around it. So yeah, it takes a real enthusiast to get excited about this one, but they are so cool. They're so small, and they have various cool ways of living and reproducing. So the first thing I want to talk about is its habitat. So this is a real dune specialist, because it grows in these dune slacks, as I say, but it doesn't grow in all of them. It only grows in the sort of really, really new ones that have just formed. They're a pioneer species. So they come in to these new dune slacks, and they start living there and growing there. But as soon as the dune slack starts getting older and more established, you get other plants coming in, and they start to sort of take over the area. The creeping willow comes in, and as soon as you get a sort of a sea of vegetation in the dune slack, the Fen Orchid tends to suffer a bit because it's so small, and it can't really deal with that sort of more compact earth and sandy soil underneath. It needs looser soil. So as soon as you get a lot of plants coming in, they sort of tie all that together and make it much tougher for the Fen Orchid. So if Emma could click once, it requires this really unstable habitat. And so one of the things they've been doing at Kenfig is scraping the dune slacks to get rid of a lot of the common vegetation, like the creeping willows and things, to create that new habitat for the Fen Orchids to come in and colonize. 2 other cool things to tell you about this one. So the next click will reveal, yes, the pollination by raindrops. So Fen Orchids, they grow in these new dune slacks, right? So the idea is they grow in areas which are largely devoid of vegetation. I realize in this photo, all you can see around the plants are other plants, but I promise this is a very small little circle of vegetation that's growing in. But yeah, in these areas which are largely just sandy soil and not much going on, there aren't always too many insects around. And so the Fen Orchids have had to come up with other ways of getting pollinated. They can't just rely on passing insects to pollinate them. And so what they've done is their flowers are adapted to be pollinated by the rain, which is just so cool. So this photo in the middle here, these open flowers, they're sort of facing upwards towards the sky. And I can't really point it out, but there's like a kind of like a funnel thing, which looks a bit like, I don't know, like a water slide. And the idea is when it rains, the raindrops come and hit that, and they're sort of directed towards the reproductive structure at the center of the flower. The raindrops sort of smash into that and knock the pollen onto the female reproductive surface and pollinate the orchids. So it's this really, really amazing mechanism to ensure that plants are pollinated. The last really cool thing, so if Emma could click one more time, is yes, this way of reproducing. So they do use seeds, like most plants do, but they also form these pseudobulbs. So there's like this kind of swelling at the bottom of the plant, and through the year, they will form like a side swelling, which sort of matures into its own plant. And when it's ready, it sort of drops off. And this is one of the reasons why they like new dune slacks, is because they've got that loose soil, loose sandy soil, and this pseudobulb can just fall off, plop straight into the sandy soil and start growing and form a new plant. In the older dunes, where the vegetation holds all the sandy soil together, the pseudobulb will just fall onto the surface, and it won't actually be able to establish itself within the soil. So that's one of the reasons why they're really adapted to that new dune slack system. So they're very, very cool plants, despite the fact they're so small and green, which I quite like about them, but obviously I realize that's not to everyone's taste. But yeah, they're very, very cool plants. So that's the Fen Orchid. If we go forward a slide, back to the dune slacks, and the next species, one more click, is the coral root orchid. I will talk about this one in a little more depth in just a second. But sandscale haws up in Cumbria has populations of this. Holy Island as well on the coast of Northumberland has a few plants. They're relatively rare in dune slacks, but they do like to grow there. And then the final dune slack species is the marsh Hellebrin, which is so beautiful. It's one of these, like, it's relatively common. Again, like if you get dune slacks, you're pretty likely to have marsh Hellebrins, but they're just the most extraordinary flowers. They've got this kind of big, frilly, white Santa beard of a petal. And then the inside of most of the petals have these really, really narrow red lines. And then they've got this big yellow nose, which is like the reproductive structures of the flower. So that's a really cool one to look out for. Slightly bigger, slightly more obvious, and very colourful if you're in the dune slacks. So yeah, the next slide, I will talk about the coral root orchids. I can't remember how many bullet points we've got here. I think 2, maybe 3. Nice. Okay, thanks, Emma. So this photo here, this coral root orchid is very green, obviously. This is actually a photo taken in its other habitat, which is sort of birch and older woodland, where it's very shady. But they do also grow in dune slacks. Now, obviously, in the dune slack, there are no trees, there's no sort of shade for them. And so they're very exposed, as I was saying earlier, to the sun. As a result, they tend to be quite red. These ones, yeah, very green, but as soon as they're put into direct sunlight, they start producing a compound called anthocyanin, which is red. And anthocyanin is basically like sunscreen. So it sort of interferes with, or sort of intercepts the UV radiation as it comes in from the sun, and stops it from damaging the DNA in the cell. So it's literally like us putting on sun cream, or producing melanin in our skin. Now, coral root orchids, like all orchids, depend on a fungal partner to survive, but coral root orchids have really taken this to the extreme. Okay, so orchids have very, very small seeds, and most plants will send their seeds off into the world with a packed lunch of sugars and starches, which takes up most of the seed. Orchids don't do this. I don't really know why. It seems a bit mean to me, but they don't send their kids off into the world with packed lunch. But what that means is their seeds can be really, really small. They can produce more of them, and those seeds can travel on the wind a lot further. But what it means is that, so the reason most plants give their seeds as packed lunch is so that when they go into the soil, they've got this period of time where they can't produce leaves. They've got to start growing, and so they depend on this packed lunch to get up, germinate, and move through the soil and start making leaves. And then at that point, they can start photosynthesizing and produce their own food. So orchids have got to get around this problem of the fact they don't have a packed lunch. And so what they do is they make friends with the fungus. It's like the first day of school. They turn up and they're like, oh, look, my mum didn't give me a packed lunch, and I don't know how I'm going to get through the day because I don't have any food. And I was just wondering if you might give me a baby bell or a Twix or something. And the fungus is like, yeah, sure. He's keen to make a friend. He's like, yeah, I'll give you my Twix, no problem. And they set up this partnership. But in reality, actually, it's that's perhaps not the best way of describing it, because the coral root orchid is like the school bully. So every day the coral root orchid is like, look, you need to give me your lunch money because I need food and I can't make it myself, so I need some food. So every single day the coral root orchid will take nutrients and take water from the fungus, which it extracts from the soil, but won't give it anything in return. And so this is how the orchid starts growing. When it puts up its flowering spikes, as you can see, the stems are green, and so it does do a little bit of photosynthesis, but largely it's completely dependent on that fungus to survive. And in such a harsh environment like a dune slack, where it's very salty and very exposed to the sun, it's all non-ideal really for most plants. It's really useful for the orchid to be able to plug into this fungus and extract everything it needs without worrying too much. Now, one final thing is, so the fungus which associates with the coral root orchid also associates with willows. And so if you're looking for coral root orchids in dune slacks, you need to find the dune slacks that have creeping willow growing through them, because that's where the coral root orchids will be. So cool, that's that one. We'll move on now to the grassland, which builds up at the back of the dunes. So this is kind of like where the marram grass starts petering out, and you get more kind of floriferous grassland. It's still very sandy, but it's sort of the older dunes that have moved backwards, and yeah, are more established. So the first species, if I'm going to click nice, is a really, really common one. And this is one that you're almost guaranteed to find in the sandy grassland behind the dunes. The pyramidal orchid, so named, as you can see in this picture, because they're kind of triangular shaped, the inflorescences. Those actually, as the plant matures and as more flowers come out, they tend to turn into cylinders rather than pyramids, or cones, I suppose is what they actually are. But yeah, it's really, really common. These bright pink splashes of colour in the grasslands. I've highlighted Braunton Burrows in Devon and Holcombe from Norfolk, but they'll grow in any sand dune system at all. So that's really common. The next one is the autumn lady's tresses, which is traditionally the last orchid to flower every year. They flower at sort of August, September time. Very small orchids, but these beautiful spirals of white flowers. So that's a really, really nice one. Generally only found along the south coast of England and Wales. So a slightly more localized one, but where it does grow, you'll often get hundreds of those growing in the very short grassland. The next one is the lizard orchid, which is really, really rare. I've given it a really high sand dune rarity score because there's only really one place where you'll find this growing in the sand dunes, and that's down in Sandwich Bay at the sort of most southeasterly point in the UK, in Kent. But there are thousands of them there. They are very, very easy to find there. But these are really, really cool plants because they've got these kind of weird sort of party streamer things, and they smell so bad. I absolutely cannot deal with the smell of this plant. Most people are like, yeah, it kind of smells weird, but I can deal with it. I just hate it. It smells like goats. So if you don't like the smell of goat's cheese, then you absolutely won't like the smell of this plant. But I just love that it kind of defies all the orchid stereotypes. We always think orchids, oh, they're so fancy and they look so nice and they smell so nice. But actually orchids are just, yeah, these orchids just smell really bad and they look kind of weird, but I love that. I love that about them. And then the final one for the sandy grassland is the bee orchid, which is my favorite plant in the world. It's such a nice one. And again, this one's relatively common. People always think that the bee orchid is quite a rare plant, but actually it grows all over the country. And yeah, we'll quite often frequent those sandy grasslands behind the dunes, particularly if you've got a road running behind the sand dunes. That's often quite a good place to look on the road verges. They love a road verge. They love a fairly new roundabout. They just like a little bit of disturbance, and so they'll quite happily grow next to the road. So the next slide, I'll talk to you a little bit about bee orchids. I'm sure many of you will have either seen these or heard this story before, but I'm going to tell you anyway because I love it. So if Emma could click once, they are insect mimicking orchids. So the bee orchid and its close relatives, fly, early spider, and late spider orchids, have evolved to exploit the sexual desire of male bees. So there's this period in the spring where male bees emerge, but the females haven't emerged yet. So the males emerge slightly earlier than the females. Now, the orchids have timed their flowering period to coincide with this period of time where there are male bees flying around, but no females. Now, to a male bee, the flower of a bee orchid looks, smells, and feels like a virgin female of its own species, which in itself is just so insane. I mean, you can see here this kind of like little hairy haunches on the side of that bee-like petal. It produces chemical compounds which match the compounds produced in the pheromones by the virgin female. So it really is this sort of incredible product of evolution that's obviously taken years and years and years to come up with, but it's just so cool. Now, our male bee is flying around. He's just emerged. He's got one job, and that's to find a female to mate with and pass on his genes to the next generation. And he's flying around in search of a female, but of course there aren't any. And he comes across a bee orchid. Now he sees what he perceives to be a female resting on the flower with her head buried amongst the petals. And he thinks, great, this is my lucky day, I've scored. And he flies down, he lands on the bee orchid flower, and still completely convinced that this is a female, he attempts to mate with the flower. Now, while this is happening, the bee orchid itself, it drops the pollen sacs onto the back of the bee's neck, and they get stuck to the bee's neck. But they're very light, and the bee has absolutely no idea this is happening. He's, having a great time. He's on cloud nine, just, completely oblivious. But after a while, our bee starts to get a bit frustrated by the lack of action, and he buzzes off in search of a more enthusiastic partner. So once again, our male bee is flying around, still no females around, and thinking, oh, I got fooled that time, but next time I'll be better. He comes across a new population of bee orchids, immediately falls for the ruse all over again, and in attempting to mate with this next flower, which he thinks is a bee, he passes, the pollen on the back of his neck comes into contact with the stigma, the female reproductive surface of the flower, and pollinates the orchid. So it's this insanely cool, really, really clever mechanism. And what I love most about it is that this entire fraud is masterminded by a plant. And it's always so good when the plants get one over on the animals. However, having told you that entire story of how, the bee orchid has evolved to do this, it's actually, it doesn't really do this anymore. So if Emma could click once, the bee orchid has, so each insect mimicking species generally, but not always, has one species of bee which will pollinate it, and they sort of evolve together, as it were. And it's thought that that species of the bee orchid has either died out or, it might have moved on to a different orchid species. But whatever's happened, it's not around anymore. So the bee orchid has had to make this drastic lifestyle change in order to survive. And so now it pollinates itself. And so you can kind of see in these photos, the best one is perhaps this one on the flower on the far right. The pollen, which is kept in that sort of duck head green thing at the top, just sort of flops down, and then the wind blows it backwards onto the reproductive surface of the flower, and they pollinate themselves. So yeah, and they're doing very well. Generally, self-pollination is non-ideal. So with climate change, it may end up with the bee orchid declining quite a lot if it can't deal with the changes in climate so well, but only time will tell. For now, it's doing extremely well. So one final habitat to tell you about, with one more click. Nice, are the pine plantations. So this is very brief, just because it's more unusual perhaps to have the pine plantations, but there are a few orchids you can find. So with one more click, we have the creeping lady's tresses, which is an orchid which generally grows in the pine forests in Scotland, but there is a population in somewhere in Norfolk, Holcombe. I think it's in North Norfolk, Holcombe. But there's a big dune system and then some pine plantations behind it. And the pine was brought in from Scotland, and it's thought that the creeping lady's tresses came with the pines, and so they're growing in the pine plantation there. But other than that, the next click, we have the green flowered Hellebrin, which is even greener and less distinct than the Dune Hellebrin, but it's quite a nice one. It grows along the Sefton coast. You get quite a few of them there, where it also grows with the Dune Hellebrin in the pine plantations themselves. So the final slide, if you could click twice. Nice, thanks. So my couple of tips for if you're planning to go to sand dunes to look for orchids, then I highly recommend picking a big sand dune system that has dune slacks in, because the dune slacks are really where the greatest abundance of orchids are. All the marsh orchids, I told you about the early marsh orchids, but they're also, southern and northern marsh orchids will grow quite happily in dune slacks. You'll get hybrids between them all over the place. So it's a really, really good place to go look for orchids. The sandy grasslands are the next best one. Where you'll get the pyramidal orchids and the bee orchids, common spotted, all sorts of things will grow there. But if you're really, really keen and you really want to go sand dune orchid hunting, then go to Kenfig Nature Reserve on the south coast of Wales, because it is just the most incredible place. Just miles and miles of sand dune system. So many dune slacks. One will be purple with marsh orchids. The next will be full of marsh Hellebrins, and the next will have barely any vegetation, and that's where the Fen Orchids grow. And now is the right time. Now is the perfect time to go. So if you do want to go and sort of dive headlong into the world of orchids and sand dunes, then Kenfig is 100% the place to go. So one final click. Thank you, Emma. You've been brilliant guiding me through the slides. Thank you so much to everyone at home. listening. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, then I'm very happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Leif. That was fantastic. We have got a couple of questions in the chat. Let me see what we've got. I mean, first little bit from me, I can't believe that fen orchids are pollinated by the rain. That's amazing. That's a lovely little fact that I'm going to keep there. So one of the first questions is, does the fungus not benefit? Now, I'm afraid I've completely forgotten which orchid you were talking about, the packed lunch fungus early combination, but what does the fungus get anything out of this relationship with that orchid, or is it purely a I'm stealing your lunch?
So it's pretty much entirely stealing your lunch. And so the fungus, it does, so what happens is the fungus sort of lives in the roots of the orchid, and then the orchid just digests it in stages. So it may get some benefits from living inside the orchid roots relative to just in the soil, but yeah, in the grand scheme of things, basically it's a one-way relationship, very much in the orchid's favor.
Okay, how about the lizard orchid then? You mentioned that it absolutely stinks. You're not a fan. I thought it was the most it looks a bit like a hairbrush, if I'm perfectly honest with you.
It's a very cool looking thing. Yeah.
It was very cool. But does the smell serve any function?
Yeah, it'll be to attract pollinators. It doesn't attract me, but I'm not the one pollinating it, so it doesn't really matter. I'm sure the lizard orchid is completely unfazed by the fact that I don't like how it smells. But yeah, it'll be attractive. I'm not sure exactly what pollinates lizard orchids. Probably some small flies or solitary bees, I imagine. But yeah, it'll serve as a attracting insects function.
Nice. And on the subject of pollination, the fen orchid, back to the fun fact about it being pollinated by the rain, is that effective, Louise asks, between individuals, or is that just for self-pollination?
That is just self-pollination, as far as I'm aware. I'm maybe in big rainstorms, the pollen gets knocked from one to the other, but I think it would probably be quite lucky to get the pollen from one to the other. Maybe in this photo here, you might be able to jump that gap. But yeah, it's largely for self-pollination. So they do, as I said, a bit of cross-pollination with insects, but yeah, they do the rain thing and then the vegetative reproduction as well. So they do a bit of everything, basically: cloning, self-pollination, and getting the insects to help out with the cross-pollination too.
I suppose that gives them the best chances, isn't it, if they've got several options?
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, we talked about the bee orchid, and we talked about how reliant they are on the male bees coming out at the right time. And Donald's actually asked a question which I was going to bring up as well. So well done, excellent one, Donald. With things like climate change changing the timings of a lot of species sometimes, are we seeing like a phenological mismatch where maybe the male bees are not coming out at the right time to be useful to the bee orchids? So Donald then asked, actually, also in terms of a decline in bee species, are drones an option to help assist with pollination, or is it purely?
That's a good question. So firstly, the first question, yes, there is. So with the early spider orchid, which is a close relative, which grows down the south coast of England, there's been this study which has shown that I think over the last, it's about I want to say about 30 to 50 year study, but I might be completely wrong. But yeah, it's showing that over time, I think it's the orchids are flowering earlier and earlier and earlier, but the bees aren't emerging at the same rate. That kind of makes sense. So at some point, that overlapping period is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And yeah, if that trend continues, then at some point in the future, there just won't be an overlap. And at that point, I suspect, unless the orchids switch to self-pollination, as the bee orchids have, then yeah, that could be a real problem there. As for whether drones make a difference, I have no idea, to be perfectly honest with you. And I'm not going to try and make something up.
I think that's probably sensible. Okay, one in from Rachel. Coral root orchids, do they have leaves if it doesn't photosynthesize?
So they kind of have they make a half-assed effort at making leaves. They've got these little flaky things which they call leaves, but aren't, They are technically leaves, but they're kind of sheaths on the stem, so they don't really do much. They're kind of like a vestigial leaf, I guess. They're not really used anymore, so they're just sort of there, but don't really do anything. So when you look at the plant, it doesn't actually look like it's got leaves. It just looks like a stalk coming up out of the ground with a few weird alien flowers on the top.
Nice. Is that what it says in the guidebooks? So a question from Erica. How long does it take from seed to flower approximately? Is it several years? Is it 1 or 2 years? And I guess a little addition question from me is, does it vary between species?
Yes, it certainly does. So things like the bee orchid are relatively quick to flower. So it would only be like a year or two between seed in the ground and actually getting a flower. At the other extreme, plants like the lady slipper orchids, which grows in Yorkshire and on limestone pavements and that sort of thing. They take, off the top of my head, I think it's about 16, 17 years to produce their first flower. So that one really takes its time and really starts, because it takes so much energy to produce one of those big flowersy flowers. But yeah, there is a massive difference in the length of time that some species take to do so. But the lady slipper is a very long-lived species. There's one in Yorkshire which is thought to be more than 100 years old, which I can't really get my head around, because that's just obviously so much longer than I've been alive, and I just can't. It's this tiny little plant. But yeah, it keeps going. So if you think about it that way, 17 years perhaps, it's not too long. Whereas a bee orchid doesn't live for that long, and so yeah, 1 to 2 years for its first flower.
Yeah, 100 years is pretty impressive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Rose asks, are there any specific caterpillars that eat marsh orchids?
Oh, I don't know. I suspect there are caterpillars that eat marsh orchids. I don't know any specifically. Although having said that, I very rarely see insect damage on the leaves. I'm sure there must be things that eat marsh orchid leaves. But yeah, I'm afraid I don't know.
Not going to make it up, sure. James has asked, going back to the fungus orchid relationship, do all orchid species rely on a fungus, or was it largely the one that you mentioned?
Yes, every single orchid species does that, but to very varying extents. So things like the coral root orchids take it quite far. There are some, like the bird's nest orchid, which go even further. So the bird's nest orchid doesn't produce any chlorophyll at all. It doesn't do any photosynthesis. It's completely brown. It looks very dead. So it's 100% dependent on the fungus in the soil. But other species, so the creeping lady's tresses, which I mentioned in the pine plantations, that one really uses the fungus when it's a seed before it produces a plant above the soil. But as soon as it's got leaves, it really it doesn't cut all connections with the fungus. It still needs it, but it does do most of its photosynthesizing by itself. It's one of the more honest orchids. So yeah, it varies a lot.
I like that, one of the more honest orchids. That's nice. So going back to your really wonderful diagram and your excellent drawing skills, Jackie has asked, so the orchids that she finds at Harlech in kind of mid Wales are mainly found on the landward side of the dunes, on ground that's quite sparsely vegetated, that can either be really dry or really wet. What habitat would you have put that in on your lovely diagram?
To me, that sounds like it's perhaps the sandy grassland part. It's hard to say without seeing it, but yeah, I would probably guess that was more of a grassland part rather than the dune slack. But it could be kind of a mix of both. I don't know. Sorry, that's really unhelpful.
No problem. We've just got a couple of minutes left, so a few more for you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. Could you tell us if orchids are a native plant to the UK?
Yes, there are more than 50 which are thought to be native to the UK. There are a few species which have appeared under sort of slightly suspicious circumstances. And so no one is really sure whether they've arrived here naturally or if they've been introduced by humans. But yes, there are certainly more than 50 species which have grown here, for years and years and years and years. And many of those will have been here since the last ice age. So yeah, definitely considered native.
And do you know how, James has asked, whether the pH, or how indeed the pH varies between the dunes themselves and the dune slacks?
Oh, that's a good question. I would imagine the pH is relative. It's more on the alkaline side than the acid side because of all the calcium that comes from the seashells. I don't know how it varies between. I suspect there's not a huge amount of variation. But yeah, it will all be alkaline rather than acidic. Yeah, the peat bogs being the acidic side of, I guess the acidic equivalent would be a peat bog.
All right, and one last one for you before we let you go then. Is there any evolutionary, so you've mentioned that often orchids will hybridize, but is there a kind of an evolutionary gain? Is there a point to them hybridizing, or are they sterile?
Oh, that's again a very good question. Well, the short answer to that would be I think basically hybrids are sometimes sterile and they are sometimes very fertile and will quite happily reproduce with anything they can get their hands on, or their flowers on rather. Basically, what I love about nature is it just does not care about the human rules which we apply to it. Nature doesn't care whether it's a species or not, and so it will just reproduce with anything that it can. And so yeah, basically there are hybrids between different species can be very evolutionarily beneficial because they can introduce new combinations of genes and alleles which yeah, if they suit a certain environment, then hybrids can become yeah, very well suited and really take off. But yeah, as you say, Emma, there are sterile ones as well. So this is probably where two species are more distantly related, and so their DNA is sort of similar enough that they can reproduce together and produce individuals, but they're different enough that those individuals are then sterile and unable to produce any more plants in the lineage. It's difficult to give a short answer to that, but I probably should be able to because I just spent 4 years studying plant hybridization. So but yeah, that's my best attempt. Don't tell my supervisor.
That was all right. That was okay. We're only going to go and put this on YouTube for your supervisor to see. So, well, thank you so much, Leif. That was fascinating. We've had loads and loads of comments coming in as well, saying that people have thoroughly enjoyed it and they're going to be off hunting their dunes. Now they know the different slack systems and all sorts and all the different habitats. They know what to be looking for. So, and thank you very much, everybody who came. You can go and get more from Leif on his Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok. You're on TikTok now and everything. And if I can, he hasn't asked me to do this, but I wholeheartedly recommend The Orchid Hunter, which is your tale of when you tried to spot all 52 species of wild British orchid in one summer, which I'm thoroughly enjoying at the moment. So I thoroughly recommend that you all go and do those things. So thank you very much for coming, and keep an eye on Dynamic Dunescapes. We'll have more events coming up for you in the summer. Don't forget to sign up to our newsletter and things like that as well, so that you can be the first to know when we get more wonderful people like Leif who know loads about a specific topic to come and talk to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.